Chicago in mid-July 1995 operates under standard procedures. The city functions without interruption. Transit systems maintain schedules. Commercial districts remain active. Municipal services continue routine operations. The forecast indicates elevated temperatures. This information circulates through standard channels. Weather services issue heat advisories. Local news mentions the forecast alongside regular programming. The temperature rise is noted as seasonal variation. Residents adjust daily patterns minimally. Some increase air conditioning usage. Others open windows during evening hours. Public pools see higher attendance. Parks host more visitors during cooler morning periods. The city infrastructure operates within normal parameters. Power consumption increases but remains within anticipated summer levels. Water usage rises. Emergency services handle typical call volumes. Heat registers as inconvenience rather than threat. The condition appears temporary. Cooling is expected overnight. Relief through weather pattern change is projected within several days. No emergency protocols activate. The municipal response system remains in standard configuration. Cooling centers exist but operate without enhanced capacity or extended hours. Public messaging emphasizes hydration and shade as sufficient mitigation strategies. The urban environment begins thermal absorption. Concrete surfaces store solar radiation. Asphalt temperatures elevate throughout daylight hours. Building materials accumulate heat energy. This process occurs continuously but draws no operational concern. The heat wave classification has not yet been applied. Temperature readings indicate elevation but not crisis. The threshold between weather event and emergency condition remains uncrossed in official assessment. Chicago maintains normal function. The administrative apparatus continues without modification. The population adapts through individual adjustment. The heat continues to build. The atmospheric pattern stabilizes over the Great Lakes region. High-pressure systems create stagnant air mass conditions. Wind velocity drops to minimal levels. The typical lake breeze effect weakens significantly. Daytime temperatures exceed 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Peak readings reach 106 degrees in some measurement stations. Humidity levels elevate concurrent with temperature rise. The heat index calculation produces values between 120 and 130 degrees. The urban canopy traps heated air. Limited air circulation prevents thermal dispersion. The lake effect that normally moderates temperature extremes becomes negligible. The city exists within a contained heat envelope. Nighttime brings no cooling cycle. Overnight low temperatures remain above 80 degrees. The diurnal temperature variation that allows building materials to release stored heat does not occur. Thermal energy accumulates across multiple day-night cycles. The human body requires nighttime cooling for thermal regulation recovery. Sleep patterns depend on temperature reduction. When ambient temperature stays elevated, physiological stress becomes continuous rather than intermittent. Buildings retain daytime heat into evening hours. Interior temperatures in structures without air conditioning exceed exterior readings due to insulation properties working in reverse. Residents experience no relief period. The atmosphere creates what meteorologists identify as heat dome conditions. The high-pressure system acts as barrier preventing cooler air penetration. Weather patterns that would normally move through the region stall. The heat becomes self-perpetuating. Forecasts continue projecting pattern break dates that fail to materialize. Each day the projected relief moves further forward in time. The duration of heat exposure extends beyond initial predictions. The absence of cooling cycle transforms acute heat stress into chronic condition. Human thermoregulation systems operate under continuous load without recovery period. The population enters a state of accumulated thermal deficit. The built environment functions as thermal mass. Materials comprising urban infrastructure possess high heat capacity. Concrete, asphalt, brick, and steel absorb solar radiation throughout daylight hours. Surface temperatures on dark asphalt exceed 150 degrees. Building facades facing direct sun reach similar values. These surfaces store thermal energy in their molecular structure. The density of construction creates reduced sky view factor. Buildings obstruct airflow at street level. The canyon effect between structures traps heated air. Natural convection that would disperse heat becomes inhibited. Green space exists in limited proportion. Vegetation provides evaporative cooling through transpiration. Areas with tree canopy show temperature differentials of 10 to 15 degrees compared to fully paved zones. Chicago's vegetation density varies significantly by neighborhood. The urban heat island effect amplifies base meteorological conditions. The city center maintains temperatures consistently higher than surrounding suburban or rural areas. This differential reaches its maximum during heat wave conditions. Material properties determine absorption and emission rates. Dark surfaces absorb more radiation than reflective surfaces. Rough textures trap heat more effectively than smooth ones. The cumulative effect of material choices across city scale produces measurable temperature elevation. At night, stored thermal energy radiates from building materials. This emission continues for hours after sunset. The environment that should cool instead remains heated from internal sources. The city glows infrared. Water and vegetation modify these physics. Permeable surfaces allow heat dissipation into substrate. Plants convert solar energy into biological processes rather than temperature increase. These moderating factors exist primarily in parks and less developed areas. The distribution of thermal mass correlates with development patterns. Dense commercial and residential districts show highest heat retention. Industrial zones with large paved areas maintain elevated temperatures. The thermal map of the city reflects its construction history. Chicago's architecture was not designed for sustained extreme heat without mechanical cooling. Chicago residential architecture evolved through climate considerations emphasizing winter heating efficiency. Construction methods prioritize insulation and weather sealing. Windows represent minority of wall surface area in many older buildings. Multi-story residential structures built in early to mid-20th century feature limited window size. Design standards emphasize structural integrity and heating cost reduction. Cross-ventilation capability was secondary consideration. Security concerns influenced building modification patterns. Ground floor windows in many neighborhoods received metal bar installation. Upper floor windows in some buildings were sealed or painted shut. These modifications reduce heat emergency exit options. Elderly residents in particular occupy buildings with security features restricting window access. Fear of crime motivates window closure even during heat. The perceived security risk outweighs thermal discomfort in resident decision-making. Building materials provide excellent insulation properties. This characteristic reduces heating costs during winter months. During summer heat wave, the same properties trap heat inside living spaces. The building envelope becomes containment rather than shelter. Apartment layouts in older structures often lack through-unit airflow paths. Single-exposure units receive ventilation from one direction only. Interior rooms possess no direct exterior access. Corridor buildings prevent cross-breeze even when windows open. Brick construction common in Chicago housing stock absorbs daytime heat and radiates inward during evening hours. The thermal mass that stabilizes winter temperatures becomes liability during sustained heat. Interior temperatures lag behind exterior but never fully cool. Roofs on flat-roof buildings reach extreme temperatures. Top-floor units experience greatest heat exposure. Dark roofing materials absorb maximum solar radiation. Inadequate attic ventilation in some structures allows heat accumulation in roof spaces. The building stock reflects priorities of different era. Design optimized for Chicago's typical climate serves winter heating needs effectively. Extended extreme heat represents condition outside design parameters. Power consumption rises sharply across the metropolitan area. Air conditioning systems operate at maximum capacity. Units designed for intermittent cooling run continuously. The electrical grid experiences demand levels approaching peak capacity thresholds. Commonwealth Edison tracks load increases through distribution network. Transformers in residential neighborhoods show elevated current draw. Thermal sensors on equipment register rising operating temperatures. The system moves toward operational limits. Individual air conditioning units cycle without rest periods. Compressors designed for intermittent operation run without break. Some units begin experiencing mechanical failures from sustained use. Others continue operating but with reduced efficiency as components overheat. The electrical demand pattern differs from typical summer peaks. Normal hot weather produces evening demand spike as residents return home. The current pattern shows sustained high load across all hours. Night demand remains elevated as cooling systems fight overnight heat retention. Distribution transformers serve multiple residences. Each transformer has rated capacity based on expected load diversity. When all connected units draw maximum power simultaneously, transformers exceed thermal design limits. Some components begin failing. Localized power outages occur in scattered locations. Circuit protection devices activate in response to overload conditions. Some areas experience rolling outages as utility attempts to balance load. Other locations face extended power loss from equipment failure. Residents without air conditioning increase fan usage. Multiple high-wattage fans operating in single unit add to total demand. Buildings without central cooling show highest concentration of plug-load electrical consumption. The power system design assumes load diversity. Not all customers draw maximum power simultaneously under normal conditions. Heat wave eliminates this diversity. Every temperature-sensitive load activates at once. Emergency generators at critical facilities add to fuel consumption. Backup power systems designed for short-duration outages run for extended periods. Diesel fuel supplies for generators become consideration. The electrical infrastructure performs under unprecedented sustained demand. High-rise residential buildings require electricity for basic operation. Elevator systems move residents between floors. Water pumps maintain pressure for upper-story units. Ventilation systems circulate air in interior spaces without windows. When local power fails, building systems cease. Elevators stop functioning. Residents in upper floors face stair access only. For elderly or mobility-impaired occupants, this creates effective confinement to residents. Water pressure depends on electric pumps in buildings above certain height. Ground floor hydrant pressure reaches only several stories through gravity. Upper floors lose water access when pumps stop. Toilets cannot flush. Hydration requires stored water. Interior corridors in larger buildings depend on mechanical ventilation. Without power, these spaces become dead air zones. Heat accumulates without circulation. The stairwells that represent emergency egress routes become thermal chimneys. Refrigeration stops during power outage. Food spoilage begins within hours. Medication requiring cold storage loses efficacy. Residents face both immediate heat stress and loss of stored resources. Battery-powered devices provide temporary lighting. Radio functions for information access. These resources deplete over hours. Recharging requires power restoration. The connected infrastructure many residents depend upon becomes unavailable. Communication systems experience degradation. Landline phones function during outage. Mobile phone towers rely on battery backup with limited duration. As outage extends, communication capability decreases. The mechanical systems that enable high-density urban living create vulnerability when power supply interrupts. Building height that optimizes land use creates dependence on electrical systems for basic habitability. Ground floor commercial spaces may remain accessible. Upper residential floors become isolated. The vertical dimension of urban density produces differential impact during infrastructure failure. Building systems were designed with backup considerations for short outages. Extended power loss during extreme heat was not primary design scenario. The compounding of heat stress and system failure produces conditions outside anticipated parameters. The city operates designated cooling centers at public facilities. Libraries, community centers, and government buildings provide air-conditioned space during business hours. These locations existed prior to heat wave and continue standard operations. Information about cooling center locations circulates through standard municipal communication channels. Local news mentions availability. City information lines provide address listings. Social service networks hold location data. Access requires multiple conditions. Residents must receive information about cooling center existence. They must possess mobility to reach locations. They must perceive heat as sufficient threat to motivate travel. They must feel safe in public facilities. Many residents most vulnerable to heat lack these access factors. Elderly individuals with limited mobility cannot easily travel to distant locations. Those without transportation rely on public transit requiring outdoor exposure during travel. Individuals with cognitive impairment may not process heat risk appropriately. The cooling centers operate during daytime hours. Evening and overnight periods show highest indoor temperatures in buildings without cooling. The temporal mismatch between facility hours and peak need creates gap in coverage. Cultural and linguistic barriers affect information transmission. Materials in English reach limited audience in multilingual neighborhoods. Trust in government facilities varies across populations. Some residents avoid public spaces due to privacy concerns or institutional wariness. The cooling center model assumes rational actor response to information. Individual receives warning, recognizes risk, travels to resource, utilizes cooling. This chain breaks at multiple points for vulnerable populations. Capacity at cooling facilities remains underutilized. Air-conditioned spaces exist with available capacity, while residents suffer heat exposure in homes. The infrastructure operates but fails to connect with affected population. Cooling center usage requires public appearance. For individuals with limited social connections, leaving home represents significant threshold. Isolation that makes cooling center access necessary also prevents cooling center utilization. The protective infrastructure exists, but does not function as system. Resources and need remain spatially and operationally separated. Heat stress affects elderly residents disproportionately. Physiological aging reduces thermoregulatory efficiency. Sweat production decreases. Cardiovascular response to heat becomes limited. Chronic medical conditions reduce adaptive capacity. Many elderly Chicago residents live alone. Family members reside in distant locations. Social networks contracted through mobility limitations and peer mortality. Daily contact with others may be minimal or absent. The isolated individual experiencing heat stress faces compounded risk. No observer monitors condition. Progressive symptoms go unnoticed. Confusion from heat affects decision-making capacity. The person who needs help cannot request help. Some residents maintain minimal contact with outside world. Mail accumulates uncollected. Phone calls go unanswered. These signals indicate potential problem but may not trigger response for days. Neighbors in urban buildings often lack relationships enabling concern. Fear influences behavior during heat emergency. Residents who keep windows closed for security maintain this practice despite heat. Those who avoid leaving residence continue isolation. The perceived safety of enclosed space becomes heat trap. Medication interactions amplify heat vulnerability. Diuretics affect fluid balance. Cardiovascular drugs modify temperature regulation. Psychiatric medications impair heat perception. Many elderly residents take multiple medications, creating complex interaction effects. The solitary person in overheated apartment faces incremental decline. Heat stress produces fatigue. Fatigue reduces activity. Reduced activity prevents cooling-seeking behavior. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. Communication technology provides limited protection. Residents must initiate contact. Heat-induced confusion prevents recognition of need. Automated check-in systems exist in limited deployment. Social fragmentation in urban environment removes informal monitoring systems. Historical neighborhood structures included regular contact and observation. Modern apartment living produces anonymity. This anonymity becomes fatal during environmental crisis. The building contains multiple residents experiencing heat stress simultaneously. Each occupies separate sealed unit. No collective awareness forms. The crisis remains individual and invisible. Chicago Fire Department receives increasing heat-related calls. Emergency medical services respond to heat exhaustion and heat stroke reports. Paramedic units transport patients exhibiting heat-related symptoms. Call volume increases beyond normal summer levels. The 911 system experiences elevated traffic. Dispatch routes available units to highest priority calls. Response time intervals lengthen as demand exceeds capacity. Paramedic units assess patients for transport decisions. Heat exhaustion patients receive hydration and cooling at scene when possible. Heat stroke cases require immediate transport. Hospital emergency departments become destination for acute cases. Emergency room capacity faces sustained pressure. Heat-related admissions continue across multiple days. Beds designated for emergency cases fill with heat patients. Treatment protocols focus on rapid cooling and hydration. Discharge depends on recovery speed and home environment assessment. Ambulance availability decreases as units remain committed to transport and hospital handoff. The fleet operates above normal utilization rates. Maintenance and restocking procedures become compressed. Crew fatigue accumulates across extended shifts. Non-emergency health services experience increased demand. Residents seeking heat relief visit clinics and urgent care facilities. Medical offices receive calls about heat symptoms. The healthcare system experiences distributed load increase. Fire department wellness checks become new task category. Requests to check on unresponsive residents increase. Units respond to perform door breaches and welfare verification. These calls compete with emergency medical responses for resource allocation. Some heat-related deaths occur before emergency contact. Residents collapse without ability to call for help. Discovery happens when concerned parties request checks. First responders find deceased individuals during welfare checks. The emergency response system design assumes incident-based demand. Structure accommodates peaks in response to discrete events. Sustained elevated demand across wide geographic area creates different operational challenge. Resource distribution requires continuous rebalancing. The system continues functioning, but operates in degraded capacity mode. Every response succeeds, but response time and resource availability decrease system-wide. Heat-related mortality occurs inside private residences. Individual collapses in apartment or home. No public signal marks the event. The death remains undiscovered until external intervention occurs. Concerned family members who maintain periodic phone contact become first indicators. Unanswered calls over multiple days trigger worry. Requests for welfare checks follow. Police or fire department personnel perform forced entry. Some residents are found by building managers. Rent collection or maintenance issues prompt entry to units. The discovery becomes incidental to other building operations. The body has been there for days. Neighbors report odors or unusual conditions. In multi-unit buildings, decomposition becomes detectable through shared ventilation or walls. This delayed signal indicates death occurred days previous. The decedent typically shows evidence of prolonged heat exposure. Body found in state of partial undress. Windows closed and secured. No air conditioning present or unit non-functional. Indoor temperature measurement reveals extreme conditions. Medical examiner cases increase in volume. Heat-related death classification requires investigation. Core body temperature cannot be determined post-mortem after extended period. Determination relies on scene evidence and exclusion of other causes. Some deaths lack immediate witnesses or documentation. Elderly individuals with minimal social connection may remain undiscovered for extended time. The mortality statistics develop slowly as discoveries accumulate. The pattern of death remains dispersed across city geography. No concentration visible to indicate scope of problem. Each incident appears isolated. The aggregate picture forms only through systematic data collection. Heat kills through physiological mechanisms that leave minimal external evidence. Unlike trauma or acute medical emergency, heat death presents as quiet shutdown of body systems. The person appears to be sleeping. Urban density creates proximity without awareness. Multiple heat deaths may occur in single building without other residents knowing. The architecture that houses population also isolates mortality from observation. Medical examiner's office receives increased death reports. Initial classification focuses on immediate cause of death. Heat, as contributory factor, requires investigation and determination. The cause of death coding system contains ambiguity regarding heat attribution. Direct heat stroke deaths show clear evidence. Body temperature elevated beyond survivable limits. No intervening cause present. These cases receive definitive heat-related classification. Other deaths show heat as contributing factor. Cardiovascular event occurs during heat stress. Respiratory failure in compromised individual under thermal load. Classification becomes complex when underlying conditions exist. The counting methodology affects reported totals. Strict definition produces lower numbers. Expansive definition including heat as contributing factor yields higher counts. Different agencies may apply different standards. Initial public death toll reports show several dozen fatalities. This number represents only confirmed direct heat deaths. As investigation continues and additional cases receive classification, totals increase. The temporal pattern of death extends beyond heat wave duration. Individuals weakened by heat exposure succumb to complications days later. The mortality impact spreads across time beyond the meteorological event. Demographic analysis reveals patterns. Elderly residents constitute majority of fatalities. Males show higher death rates than females. Geographic distribution shows neighborhood clustering. Single-person households predominate among decedents. Some deaths remain unattributed to heat. Classification practices vary between jurisdictions. Suburban areas surrounding Chicago report separately. The metropolitan total requires aggregation across multiple reporting systems. Historical comparison provides context. Previous heat waves show mortality patterns. The 1995 event exceeds historical death tolls. Chicago's heat mortality rate surpasses other cities experiencing similar meteorological conditions. The final death count requires months to establish. Retrospective analysis includes cases initially classified under other causes. Statistical excess mortality analysis shows deaths above expected baseline. Official toll stabilizes above 700 deaths attributed to heat wave. This number represents confirmed cases meeting classification criteria. The true mortality impact may include additional unattributed deaths. Municipal government initially treats heat as routine summer condition. Standard response procedures remain in effect. Enhanced emergency protocols do not activate during early heat wave period. The administrative threshold for extraordinary measures is not crossed. Weather forecasts provide advance notice of sustained heat. Information circulates through governmental communication systems. Individual departments receive data, but coordinate response remains limited. No central command structure activates. Public messaging emphasizes individual responsibility. Residents advised to stay hydrated, seek shade, check on neighbors. The response model assumes population capacity for self-protective action. Structural barriers to protection receive minimal policy attention. As reports of heat-related illness increase, response remains departmental rather than coordinated. Emergency services handle medical calls. Building department addresses power outage complaints. No unified command structure emerges. The classification of event as emergency occurs after mortality evidence accumulates. Public health authorities recognize pattern in death reports. By this point, peak heat exposure has already occurred for many vulnerable residents. Political and administrative factors influence response timing. Declaring heat emergency carries operational and public perception implications. Officials weigh evidence against organizational and political considerations. The decision threshold requires clear crisis indicators. Media coverage increases as death toll becomes apparent. Pressure for governmental response builds through public and journalistic attention. The institutional response cycle lags behind actual crisis timeline by days. Cooling center capacity increases after need peak has passed. Extended hours and additional locations activate in response to documented mortality. The protective measures implement after heat wave meteorological conditions begin moderating. Interdepartmental coordination challenges emerge. Different agencies operate under separate protocols. Information sharing requires establishment of communication channels not used in routine operations. The learning curve occurs during active crisis. The delay between crisis onset and full institutional response represents structural characteristic. Government systems optimize for routine operation. Activation of emergency mode requires recognition, decision-making, and implementation time. Electrical grid load decreases as temperatures begin moderating. Utility completes repairs to failed infrastructure components. Power restoration proceeds through affected areas. Air conditioning systems resume operation. The discovery of heat-related deaths continues after meteorological conditions improve. Welfare checks requested days earlier proceed through backlog. Building managers entering units for maintenance find deceased residents. Family members arriving for planned visits discover fatalities. The temporal disconnect becomes apparent. Weather conditions that caused heat stress have passed. The consequences continue manifesting through delayed discovery and long-term health impacts. Some individuals survived heat wave peak but sustained organ damage. Heart, kidney, and brain injuries from heat exposure produce delayed mortality. Hospital patients who appeared to recover experience complications. The death toll increases after heat wave ends. Vulnerable residents who depleted resources during heat face continuing crisis. Food supplies exhausted. Medication gone. Physical capacity diminished. The heat wave produces lasting deficit even as temperatures normalize. Buildings that absorbed heat require extended period to cool. Thermal mass releases stored energy slowly. Interior temperatures in non-air-conditioned spaces remain elevated days after exterior conditions moderate. Residents continue experiencing heat stress in lagging environment. The emergency response system continues processing cases generated during peak heat period. Medical facilities treat complications and secondary conditions. Coroner investigations proceed. Social service interventions address post-heat situations. Public attention increases after meteorological event concludes. The mortality statistics accumulate through investigation and reporting. News coverage intensifies as scope of casualties becomes documented. Political response accelerates. The pattern demonstrates disaster extending beyond triggering event duration. The heat wave as meteorological phenomenon lasted specific days. The heat wave as mortality event spans weeks. The infrastructure failure and its human consequences operate on different timescales. The city returns to functional normal while continuing to count its dead. The crisis simultaneously ends and persists depending on which system receives attention. Heat-related mortality distributes non-randomly across Chicago geography. Certain neighborhoods show elevated death rates. Others experience heat wave with minimal mortality. The pattern reflects urban form and social structure rather than meteorological variation. Neighborhoods with older building stock show higher impact. Buildings constructed before air conditioning era lack cooling infrastructure. Resident populations in these areas include higher proportion of elderly and low-income households. The built environment and demographic composition combine. Areas with strong social networks demonstrate lower mortality rates. Neighborhoods with active community organizations, churches, and social clubs show evidence of informal checking systems. Residents with regular social contact receive assistance during crisis. Isolation occurs less frequently. Commercial density provides protective effect. Neighborhoods with shops, restaurants, and public spaces offer cooling options. Residents have destinations within walking distance. The public realm provides refuge alternatives to home. Spatial analysis reveals clustering. Heat deaths concentrate in specific census tracts. Adjacent areas with similar weather conditions show different outcomes. The variation indicates local factors beyond meteorology determine vulnerability. Single-room occupancy buildings and boarding houses show elevated mortality. These housing types concentrate isolated individuals with limited resources. Room units lack cooling and often restrict window access. Resident population includes mentally ill, substance users, and extremely poor. Racial and ethnic patterns appear in mortality data. African American neighborhoods show disproportionate death rates. Hispanic communities demonstrate some protective factors possibly related to household structure and social connection. The data reveals health inequity under environmental stress. Suburban areas surrounding Chicago experience same heat wave with lower mortality impact. Lower building density, higher prevalence of air conditioning, automobile access, and newer housing stock create different vulnerability profile. The mortality crisis remains primarily urban core phenomenon. The geographic pattern indicates heat wave exposed existing urban inequalities. Neighborhoods already experiencing social and economic stress showed greatest mortality. Heat acted as stress test, revealing system weaknesses. City planning, housing policy, and social structure determined who died during Chicago heat wave. Temperature affected everyone equally. Consequences distributed according to accumulated inequality. The mortality statistics force policy reevaluation. Heat emerges as recognized public health emergency category. Previous classification as inconvenient weather shifts to environmental disaster requiring coordinated response. Chicago implements heat emergency protocols. The plan establishes trigger temperatures for response activation. Cooling center operations receive standardized procedures with extended hours and enhanced capacity. Public messaging systems prepare advance notifications. The buddy system receives policy emphasis. Public campaigns encourage residents to identify isolated neighbors and maintain contact during heat events. Building managers receive instructions for checking on vulnerable tenants. Social service agencies incorporate heat checks into client contact protocols. Electrical infrastructure receives assessment and upgrades. Utility companies identify grid components requiring reinforcement for heat-related demand. Transformer replacement programs prioritize high-load residential areas. Emergency response plans for power outage during heat events develop. Building code examinations consider heat resilience. Window restrictions for security receive analysis for emergency access balance. Retrofit programs for cooling in low-income housing receive funding consideration. The building stock that proved lethal becomes policy concern. Public health surveillance systems add heat monitoring. Hospital emergency department data flows to centralized tracking. Real-time awareness of heat-related illness patterns enables responsive deployment of resources. Early warning indicators receive integration into emergency management operations. The National Weather Service enhances heat warning systems. Heat index thresholds receive refinement. Warning dissemination expands to multiple communication channels. Coordination with local emergency management improves forecast-to-action translation. Other cities examine Chicago experience for applicable lessons. Urban heat emergency planning spreads through public health and emergency management networks. The disaster model expands to include non-event environmental conditions requiring sustained response. Research programs investigate urban heat vulnerability. Academic and governmental studies examine building design, neighborhood characteristics, and social factors determining heat mortality risk. The evidence base for intervention strategies develops. Heat transitions from act of nature to preventable mortality cause. The institutional framework begins treating sustained high temperature as emergency condition, requiring proactive protective response rather than individual adaptation challenge. No debris field marks the heat wave's location. No collapsed structures require clearance. No floodwater leaves sediment. The city's infrastructure remains physically intact. Evidence of the disaster exists almost entirely in records, tables, and retrospective analysis. More than 700 people died within a single week inside one metropolitan area. The mortality rivaled that of major hurricanes and earthquakes, yet the built environment showed no corresponding damage. Streets remained open. Buildings stood unchanged. Daily life resumed with few visible interruptions. The deaths occurred inside homes and apartments, distributed across the city rather than concentrated at a single site. Each fatality unfolded in private space, beyond public visibility. There was no moment of collective recognition. The scale of loss emerged only later, through investigation and counting. Protective systems existed. Cooling centers operated. Medical services remained functional. Communication infrastructure stayed intact. The failure was not the absence of resources, but the inability of those resources to reach the people most at risk. Those who died shared identifiable characteristics. They were predominantly elderly, socially isolated, and living in buildings that trapped heat. These risk factors were known before the event. The environmental threat was forecast. The vulnerability was mapped. The outcome did not change. The heat wave did not overwhelm the city through force. Temperatures exceeded human tolerance but remained survivable with access to cooling, assistance, and social connection. Mortality resulted from the intersection of isolation, building design, poverty, and delayed institutional response. Similar heat events occurred before 1995 and have occurred since. Under comparable meteorological conditions, outcomes varied widely between cities. Heat alone did not determine mortality. System performance determined mortality. The Chicago heat wave entered public health literature and emergency management doctrine. It is cited in policy documents and academic analysis. Its lessons reshaped planning frameworks, but it left little mark on public memory. There is no central memorial, no annual commemoration. The event persists quietly in data and procedures rather than in monuments or stories. The disaster left no ruins to revisit. The heat receded, the city continued, the numbers remained. The quietest disaster leaves the faintest trace.